I first discovered my passion for urban exploring when I was 16 years old. My parents were going to a jazz show one night and insisted that I stay with a girl from school, since they didn't trust a teenager like me not to throw a huge party or get into some other kind of trouble in their absence. All of my friends were guys, and staying at a boy's house was out of the question, so that left Kayla. Kayla and I got along well at school, but we weren't close. I had never been to her house before, and she had never been to mine. My mum knew Kayla's grandmother, Violet. Violet worked at the local library, where my mother would go every Sunday evening. My mother and Violet had gotten to know each other quite well over time. Apparently, Kayla's mum had died from a drug overdose not long after she was born, so Violet had taken it upon herself to raise Kayla. On the day of the sleepover, Kayla and I walked back to her house straight after school. It was during the walk that she informed me we would be exploring the old hospital that night. I asked her if her grandmother would be okay with us doing that. Kayla winked and said, "She'll never know. Once she takes her arthritis medication, she's out like a light." The old hospital had sat vacant ever since the new one had been built 10 years ago. I was a bit anxious about my parents somehow finding out about what we were doing, but still excited. I had always been curious about the old hospital and wondered what it would be like to go inside. I had never been urban exploring before, or even been inside an abandoned house, but it had always been something I wanted to do at least once. When we arrived at Kayla's house, Violet's car was sitting in the driveway. She drove a modern Volkswagen Beetle, painted to look like a purple ladybug. Violet was a bit strange, a typical grandmother, but not at the same time. She was eccentric and quirky and dressed kind of gothic, not the way most people in their 60s would dress. She had a nose ring, tattoos, and dyed her hair bright purple. Despite this, she still attended bingo nights and sang in the church choir. I'd heard Violet was quite strict with Kayla too, or at least tried to be. Violet greeted us both warmly and already had snacks prepared. Her house was just as unusual as she was. It was structured so that you walk straight into the kitchen from the front door, and off to the right was a large sunken lounge room with an aquarium instead of a TV and walls that were lined with bookshelves. To the left was a very wide, long hallway leading up to the two bedrooms and bathroom. Along the oversized hallway were four retro diner booths, which complemented the design of her kitchen. We sat in one of the diner booths to eat the scones and the fruit platter Violet had prepared for our afternoon snack. I was very impressed with the level of hospitality. After we had finished our snacks, Kayla showed me to her room and we discussed our plans for the night. Kayla's boyfriend would be picking us up an hour after Violet went to bed, just to be sure that she'd be fully asleep. He was older than us and had a car. I was also told he would be bringing alcohol to share. We planned to explore the abandoned hospital and be back in time to get a few hours sleep before my parents would be picking me up in the morning. That night we ate dinner together at the kitchen table, as the diner booths were too small to accommodate the feast Violet had prepared. She'd gone above and beyond with roast chicken and pork, all different kinds of vegetables, and instead of serving dessert separately, she had set out little plates of cakes and slices with the main course. Everything was delicious, especially the homemade gravy. Over dinner, Violet talked about how nice it was to have me around and how nice it would be for Kayla to have friends over more often. She spoke fondly of my mother and said that she was very excited when she'd asked her if I could spend the night. I responded that my mother had said she always recommended the best books and knew so much about local history, which Violet seemed to appreciate. I was tempted to ask about Kayla's mother, but thought better of it. That was likely to have been a sensitive subject, and I had no intentions to upset anyone. Kayla didn't join in with our conversations much. She was probably too busy thinking about the adventure we were going to have later on, or possibly embarrassed. It was apparent that Kayla rarely had friends over. I thought it was sweet how much effort Violet had put into the food and making me feel welcome. When we had finished eating, Violet said that she was too tired to clear the table and would deal with it in the morning. I offered to clean up since I was their guest, and she'd made such a lovely meal, but Violet insisted that we go and enjoy our night and suggested that we watch Netflix or Stan on Kayla's laptop. Then she went into the lounge room to read. Kayla and I decided that we would watch a movie on her laptop to kill the time while we waited for Violet to go to bed. About halfway through the movie, Kayla said that she was tired of waiting and asked me to join her in the kitchen. She put the kettle on and asked Violet if she would like a cup of tea. Violet accepted this offer, and Kayla made a cup of tea for each of us. She handed me mine, sat hers on the table, then took a small packet of white powder out of her pocket and poured it into Violet's drink. I whispered, "What is that?" Kayla assured me that it was just melatonin powder to help Violet get to sleep faster. Then she went over to the cupboard and took out a box of codeine tablets. She popped out 2 pills and carried them over to Violet with the mug of tea. Violet took them from her with a smile and told Kayla that she was such a sweet girl and she was very proud of the young lady she was turning out to be. We went back to Kayla's room and finished the movie. We hadn't seen Violet go past us to her room and assumed that she must have fallen asleep on the couch, which is exactly what had happened. Kayla would have been fine with leaving her there, but I insisted that we help her off to bed. Violet was quite small, and it was easy for the 2 of us to carry her to the bedroom. We put her into bed, and Kayla pulled the purple silk and black lace doona up to her chin. Violet suddenly opened her eyes and stared vacantly. Then, in a dreamlike state, she said, "I'm so sorry, Daisy. Please don't leave us again." I asked Kayla who Daisy was, and she said that Daisy was her mother. I noticed an old photograph on the bedside table, which pictured a much younger Violet and a little girl of about 4 or 5. That must have been Daisy. Kayla's boyfriend picked us up at around 10 p.m. and we drove over to the old hospital. It wasn't hard to get inside since the building had already been broken into countless times before. I was expecting there to be some kind of alarm system, or at least a security guard patrolling the area, but there was nothing. Most of the windows had been smashed and the interior walls were covered in graffiti. The floor was littered with all kinds of trash, from empty bottles and food wrappers to dirty clothes and drug paraphernalia, even a few used condoms and tampons. As we made our way through the building, I noticed a couple sleeping on a filthy mattress in the corner. There were a few other squatters roaming about, but they didn't seem to mind us being there and ignored us completely. I was fascinated, scared, and deeply disturbed all at once, and I loved it. I filmed it all on my phone, which ended up being the first video posted to my YouTube channel years later. When we got to the top floor, we came across what appeared to be the end result of some kind of ritual. I won't go into detail, but it was absolutely horrific. I felt sick. I can't explain why, but I got a real kick out of scaring myself, and this was the first time I'd ever experienced being truly afraid. The other 2 wanted to leave after seeing what was on the top floor, and I didn't argue with them. Kayla's boyfriend dropped us off back at her house, and eventually we fell asleep. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of my phone ringing. It was my parents calling to let me know that they were on their way over to pick me up. I got out of bed and went to brush my teeth. Kayla didn't wake up, and I decided to let her sleep, until I realized that it was almost 11 a.m. and Violet still wasn't up. The table had not been cleared from the night before, and her car was still in the driveway, which I found odd since Violet always worked weekends. At that point, I was very concerned and decided to wake Kayla. She didn't want to get up and said that Violet was probably just having a sleep-in. I insisted that she go and check on her anyway, which she agreed to do after a bit of nagging. I followed Kayla to her grandmother's room and stood in the doorway. Kayla gently shook Violet and tried to wake her up, but she was completely unresponsive. Then my parents called again to say that they were waiting outside. I asked Kayla if she wanted me to call an ambulance or go and get my parents, but she insisted that I go and said that she would call an ambulance herself. I'm not proud of this, but I have to admit I did leave. I was afraid of getting into trouble and took comfort in the fact that Kayla was calling an ambulance. I texted Kayla later in the day to see how Violet was doing. She said it had been discovered that Violet had diabetes and had gone into a diabetic coma. Apparently, they had made it to the hospital just in time to save her life. Kayla also mentioned that she would be taking some time off from school so that she could take care of Violet. 2 weeks went by before I heard from Kayla again. She texted me to say that they would be moving to another city to live with Violet's younger sister and asked if I wanted to get a coffee before they left. I met Kayla at a coffee shop the day after she had texted me. She explained that they had to move in with Violet's sister because she didn't want to be the only one around if Violet's health deteriorated even further. We said goodbye, and that was the last I ever saw of Kayla. After graduating from high school, I moved to the other side of the city and joined a group of urban explorers. I started a YouTube channel that documented all our adventures. It actually ended up being quite successful. One day, Jaden, one of the group members, found out about an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of the city, and we decided to explore it. We had to plan it very carefully, as produce was still being grown on the property, and we knew that there would definitely be some sort of security system in place. We decided to go early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. I filmed with a body cam these days to leave my hands free. This made it much easier if we needed to make a quick escape, and I found the film quality to be much better, as the camera was always pointed at what I was seeing. We arrived at the property at around 6 a.m. and parked the van a good distance away from the main entrance. Out of sight, but still close enough to make a quick getaway if we needed to. There were security cameras mounted on the fence, too high for us to cover. There were 2 workers wearing high-vis gear up in the distance, over near a large shed which had obviously been built much more recently than the old farmhouse. Steph had scoped the place out using satellite view on Google Earth and suggested that we go through the bushland that bordered the back fence of the property and break in using bolt cutters. I have to admit, we weren't always ethical, but it gets like that once you make it big on YouTube. Lettuce, spinach, and a few other kinds of vegetables were grown all around the property, except for one small patch of land where the farmhouse sat, which was conveniently situated along the back fence. Steph led the way, while Jaden, Cal, and I followed closely behind. We cut through the fence and made our way into the farmhouse. It was completely empty besides a few old photographs left lying around and a broken chair in what appeared to be the lounge room. The wallpaper had started to peel and the floorboards were beginning to rot. Based on our research, the house had been built in the early 1920s and stayed in the same family until the property was foreclosed and sold to a produce company 15 years prior. Kel and Steph wanted to go upstairs, but I advised them not to since there was no guarantee that the stairs wouldn't cave in beneath their feet. They ignored my warning and started to climb the corroded staircase, when a security guard barged in and yelled at us, saying that we were trespassing and he was calling the police. Kel's foot fell through one of the steps and got stuck. Steph frantically tried to help him pull his foot out, while Jaden and I tried to reason with the security guard. He seemed to be on a power trip and kept insisting that we couldn't leave until the cops arrived, and we would be prosecuted. Cal eventually managed to free himself, and we pushed past the security guard and ran back to the van. We always took certain precautions to conceal our identities when exploring, for situations such as this one, but also to remain anonymous online. I posted the video of the farmhouse as soon as we had escaped and found a place to camp for the night. The views quickly skyrocketed. The next morning, Jaden suggested that we take a longer route home and drive around for a while to see if there were any other places worth exploring. We all thought this was a great idea, considering we'd already explored everything there is to see in our area. The first abandoned building we came across was an old motel with a restaurant. As with most deserted buildings, the motel and restaurant were both covered in graffiti, and most of the windows and doors had been broken. A lot of furniture had been left behind, including a few ornaments and paintings. They probably weren't worth much since they had been left behind, but we took them anyway. When I first got into urban exploring, I had 3 rules. 1. If you cannot gain access to the property without breaking something, do not enter. 2. Never take anything from any of the properties. 3. Be respectful of any squatters and avoid getting their faces on camera. All of that changed once we became popular on YouTube. We broke into places, took things to sell to our followers or give away as prizes, and posted whatever footage was captured regardless of any squatters or security guards that happened to be there. There had been a few instances where we came across animals living in the buildings and rescued them. My own dog was found living in an abandoned church. I often found myself using these examples to justify breaking the rules. After we had finished with the motel, we got back into the van and continued to drive around in search of more exploration sites. Eventually, we found ourselves in the suburb where I had grown up. I hadn't been there in years, since my parents had also moved away around the time that I did. We drove past my old house and the high school I went to. We were about to head home when Steph pointed out a rundown old house hidden amongst some trees. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and a branch from one of the trees had grown right through a window. It was definitely a place we had to check out. We pulled up and started to look for a way in. Everything was locked, so we decided that cutting off the tree branch and climbing through the window would be easier than trying to break in another way. It was a team effort, but eventually we managed to cut through the branch. We placed it down carefully next to the house, then Jaden got out the blanket we used for breaking and entering, to avoid cutting ourselves on broken glass or barbed wire. We had to climb over a sink full of dishes, which was unusual, and found ourselves in the kitchen. The dining table appeared to have been set for a feast, although there was no way of telling what kind of food had been prepared, as everything had been consumed by mold. I suddenly had a flashback of that night at Kayla's when Violet had made us dinner. After scanning over my surroundings, I quickly realized that this was in fact Violet's house. All of her things were still there. The skeletal remains of dead fish floated around in the murky aquarium in the lounge room. Violet's chair and bookshelf were still in their place, now coated with a thick layer of dust. All 4 diner booths still lined the hallway. "Guys, I know this house," I called out as I quickly made my way down the hallway and into Kayla's room. Despite being covered with dust and cobwebs, her room looked exactly as it had the last time I'd seen it. It looked as though she hadn't taken any of her belongings with her when they moved away. I made my way up to Violet's room. When I opened the door, I froze, and my heart felt like it was stuck in my throat. There was a mound underneath the covers, on the side of the bed where I had last seen Violet. I knew instantly what was under there and started to panic. I didn't want to look, but I had to know for sure. I tried to pull back the covers, but when I touched it, it felt stiff and sticky. I gagged and ran out of the room in tears. Steph, Jaden, and Kel all hurried over, trying to make sense of what was going on. I was too hysterical to articulate myself properly. All I could manage to get out was, "You have to go and look, Steph, please. I can't do it, but someone has to. And I pointed towards Violet's bedroom. Steph calmly made her way over to Violet's room. Kel and Jaden stood beside me looking confused. When Steph came back, she was as white as a ghost and said, "Guys, there's a fucking corpse in there. I'm sure it's legit. There are decomposition stains all through the bed." She sat down on the ground and buried her face in her hands. I took a moment to compose myself, then said, "I have to call the police. I think I know what happened." I tried to convince the others to leave so they wouldn't get done for trespassing, but they wouldn't go. We all went and stood outside while I phoned emergency services. I never went urban exploring again after that day.